Facebook, YouTube. Welcome to the NFT.NYC event. I'm now here with Michael Casey in the PlayStation Theater in Times Square, New York, with a very electric yet friendly crowd. So, how has it been for you so far this morning?
Hi, Ian. Thanks for having me. Look, what really excites me about this is this feel of the beginning of something new, right? And I've been in Bitcoin for the blockchain Bitcoin space for about 5 or 6 years. By no means right there at the beginning, but 5 or 6 years makes me something of a veteran, right? I remember the early Bitcoin conferences and this excitement in the air that this was something new. Conferences were scrappy. They were kind of like new ideas bubbling out of it. There wasn't sort of all the big, names behind it. It was really, really inspiring. This is feeling the same way. There's something in the air about NFTs that I think is really interesting. It's a new, fresh look at things. And I generally think that it's getting people to think outside the box as to what we can do with just blockchains generally, but obviously specifically with NFTs. There's a whole lot of new, really interesting ideas that are bubbling up out of this. And so I'm excited about it. Yeah, definitely.
And you spoke this morning about why are NFTs important? Yep. And so give us a little, insight, kind of a high level, not what are NFTs. If you don't know, it's pretty simple. You can Google and find out, or watch one of the 104 videos we already created and posted. But why are they important in general, and why are NFTs important to you?
Right. Well, I would say they're important to me, and they're important in general for the same reasons, that we live in an attention economy where everybody is a creator, where media and digital content is the sort of underlying feature of the 21st century economy, right? The problem we have with that is there is no way to map what happens to that content. It disappears into black holes that are controlled by large data aggregators. We call them GAFA, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple. That process makes it very difficult for us to create the kind of relationships that we want with each other, whether we are a producer selling to a consumer or just an average Joe trying to communicate with somebody else, right? We're stuck inside these siloed controlled settings. So blockchain helps us deal with this to one extent on its own, but what NFTs do is they allow us to map the claims on the original content that we create and then have a provenance to that, right? So now we can start to look at what this world of all of this content starts to look like and place some value on it and figure out how to actually interact with each other in a way that resolves this core trust problem that's always made it very difficult for us and has led us to require these intermediaries in the first place, right? So look, it's one building block for what I would call Internet 3.0, one that is not so beholden on these data aggregating behemoths that run our lives. We have to fix this problem because it's a fundamentally difficult situation that the world has entered into, and NFTs are a very important building block in the solution as far as I can tell.
Now, you and I met at CES a few weeks ago, and you were helping to lead kind of the blockchain ecosystem of stages and talks. How might you imagine CES, blockchain, NFT conversations be different next year and maybe be different, 10 years from now? Like there's now, there's pretty soon, and then there's pretty distant out. What do you imagine for a ecosystem like CES, this long-standing ecosystem, a lot of kind of things that are set in motion? How might things change inside of this ecosystem around the conversation of blockchain and NFT?
Right, so what I'm hoping, and I don't necessarily predict, I'm not very good at being a futurist, but I would hope that over the course of the year, as this conversation grows, you're going to get real world companies that step in and say, hey, this is a really interesting idea. There's a whole new business model that I can create out of this, whether it is turning my virtual goods in my gaming environment into some sort of collectible item that lives outside my platform that I can now monetize in a different way, or whether it's companies that figure out ways to essentially build new systems of social capital that either challenge or just give us an alternative to the existing Facebook. So those conversations, I'm hoping, are the sorts of things, not necessarily the products themselves, but the conversations from real world companies, not just sort of crypto fanatics, but people who are able to say, hey, this solves a problem, all right? And the music world, for example, is facing huge problems in terms of how they are able to, or unable rather, to interact with their fans. Something like this empowers that. So will musicians and music companies involved in this space get interested in it? That, I think, is the first phase. And obviously in 10 years' time, my dream, again, I'm not predicting, I'm just saying what I would hope to be the case, is that we actually live in a different world where we have broken the problem of the attention economy. And that rather than have this very unhealthy environment where advertisers are basically stealing your, or trying to steal your or my attention, in an environment where the data is opaque and difficult to understand, instead there is a connection between the content provider, the advertiser who's participating in a constructive way through a token, and the user. And there's this sort of healthy engagement where behavior is being incentivized through those models. I see NFTs as being a really powerful way to connect not just the virtual gaming world, but with the real world in terms of how brands and companies are able to incentivize behavior that they can be positively associated with, right? So that is my vision for where it goes, that ultimately this is integrated into the entire way in which we construct the digital economy, instead of this rather invasive, unhealthy attention economy that we currently live in.
And now you and Jody Rich have known each other for quite some time. He put this event on. You started to talk about having you be kind of the opening talk. What's your thoughts on what Jody's currently doing in this space and kind of him as a leader as this space moves forward?
Well, I just think throwing this event for itself is just a really important moment, right? It brings the community together. So it's both the attendees, but also the speakers and obviously the presenters. This idea that there is a community around this is critical to the build out of the ecosystem. So NFT.NYC is a great starting point for how to make this happen. In addition to that, I think that he's thinking outside the box in terms of how do we create value and how do we create relationships between people, and the idea that we can tokenize things like redeemable time and the like, and that I can actually place this thing as a unique representation of value to share with somebody else. That builds those connections between people. So I think just thinking outside the box in terms of how we can construct new systems of value and getting others through conferences like this to sort of run along with that idea and then build out upon it. It's wonderful. I mean, it's a great building block for an interesting future.
Yeah. Maybe that's the last thing we should chat about, the future. So, I'm not asking for you to predict, but hope. I'm talking tonight about NFT 2024. My goal was to interview as many speakers as I could, get the collective hope, and then kind of share that collective hope in a clear, concise way tonight. So why don't you add to my collection of hope for what this could be in 5 years. NFT 2024, what are some desires that you'd like to see, desirable outcomes for this industry?
Well, I'd love to see these new forms of token to be shared within the world, that they become an integral part of how we actually engage with each other in the digital economy, and people just treat them as something normal and valuable, and that we've now made this leap in the process. I want to see human beings recognize that value is something that has always been constructed socially, and therefore that we can, it doesn't matter if it's a dollar or a Venezuelan bolivar or whatever, its value is always a social construct. The idea that we can actually have these new forms of value that aren't tied down to these sovereign rules and so forth, that we can then construct relationships around. I want to see that leap of logic, which is difficult for people, but if we can make these things more fluid in the world, then hopefully we get there. And once we do that, the prospects for sort of reinventing economic behavior and incentives and so forth are profound. So it's really this sort of cultural understanding that I would love to see happen. It's a lot of work to get there, but let's hope we can.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me. That was fun to get to know you.